Hello and welcome to Beyond Today, the program that addresses the future of our community through conversations with people who are working today for a better tomorrow. I'm Ray Charmonti, your host for Beyond Today and Assistant Executive Director for the Hillsborough County City-County Planning Commission. In our last program, we talked about new trends in environmental planning. Today, we want to take a look back to see how the past influences the future. We want to look at the City of Tampa from annexation and urban renewal from the 20s, 30s, through the 50s and 60s. Our guest is Bob Kerstein, Professor of Political Science at the University of Tampa. Welcome to the show, Dr. Kerstein.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you a question, and I probably didn't talk to you about this before, but actually, how long have you been in Tampa?
I moved here in 1977 in the summer.
Okay, so you've been here over 20 years.
Yep.
And managed to get, I guess, a flavor for the community.
Yeah, I think so.
I'd like to go back a little bit to Tampa's origins and talk about the politics a little bit of this community. Often there's debate nowadays about what type of community we are and that we're somewhat unique. But when you go back to the early part of the century, what do you think makes Tampa a little bit different than other southern cities?
The stereotype of southern cities is that they developed around a commercial base, having relatively limited industrialization, relatively limited immigration. We're talking about the period after about the turn of the century. That fits many southern cities, maybe especially southwestern cities. It certainly doesn't fit Tampa, nor actually does it fit several other cities. Birmingham obviously revolved around the steel industry for decades, and so on. We clearly differ from the stereotype in that we grew around the cigar industry, and immigration was vital to the cigar industry from Cuba, from Italy, from Spain, generally indirectly Spain, Cuba, sometimes Key West and Tampa. So we clearly differ dramatically in terms of the economic base, in terms of the demographics. And our politics certainly weren't a tame politics, if that's what the stereotype of Southern politics suggests. So it was kind of a rough and tumble, semi-machine politics, more analogous to the politics of many Northeast and Midwestern cities at the turn of the century than the stereotype of Southern cities.
So really early on, Tampa's characteristics politically really were more like a northern city than another southern city.
They don't fit the stereotype of southern cities more closely. Yes, I think that's true.
Well, I guess would New Orleans fit into that role a little bit?
Many people compare Tampa to New Orleans in a variety of respects, including machine-like politics, including sometimes several families being relatively conservative, controlling a lot of what went on in the community. Many similarities, yeah.
So Tampa always has had this diversity, and you use the term rough and tumble. We might not just expect things to always run real smoothly here then, I guess even now, with that kind of background.
Well, that's true. Well, you had a mix. You had, in terms of the economy, you had often several families, several businesses dominate to a relatively significant degree. But there were always political, not always, generally speaking, political conflicts, sometimes relatively hard-fought conflicts at different points in time. For example, recently I've been looking at the 1920s, and you had a major conflict in 1920. On one side was D.B. McKay, and most of us know that name from McKay Auditorium, etc., and his allies, many of them related by marriage, etc., and also just part of his kind of loose-knit political organization. He, by the way, was also publisher of the Tampa Daily Times. And on the other side were people associated with the Tribune and many in the business community who, for whatever reason, wanted a change in government from a mayor council to a commission manager form, I think in large part to get rid of McKay and what they saw as his quote-unquote machine. They also maybe honestly felt that that would be a better type of government. They had been calling for it for many years, and the Tribune had started calling for it, I believe, 1910, 1912. So.
Just out of curiosity, what was the end result of that? Who won that debate?
McKay lost in 1910. I apologize, in 1920. However, he came back, and in 1927 they got rid of the commission manager form and went back to the mayor council. Although then Mayor McKay was soon challenged by another political organization that was dominated by Pat Whitaker, a very well-known lawyer and state senator, and Ariel Chansey, who became mayor for many, many years. They were, I guess, brother-in-law was the connection by marriage.
So basically the mayor-council system survived to modern times then.
Yes, so there was a charter change in 1945 that reduced the number of people on the council, and perhaps more importantly, brought about an at-large system of electing city council people, as opposed to one where it was primarily by district. And then, as you know, in the 80s, we again had a change for being elected district and 3 at-large.
I recently read an article you had in, I guess it's the Tampa Bay History Journal, regarding Tampa's growth, which I thought was very interesting, and it dealt with annexation and how the city expanded. I'm sure a lot of our viewers probably don't realize that in area, Tampa covered a much smaller piece of land back in the 20s than it does now. Explain that a little bit of how that worked.
Tampa had a series of annexations. One major one was accomplished January 1, 1925. West Tampa had been a separate municipality. It was incorporated into the city of Tampa. As you know, West Tampa was kind of a second Ybor city in the sense of being largely a Latin community revolving around the cigar industry, though it had been developed by Hugh McFarlane, who was from Scotland. In 1925, it became part of Tampa, adding to the population, adding to the economic base, and adding significantly to the Latin population. West Tampa went basically from Boulevard to Howard. We had some small annexations. 1953, a very major one was accomplished, and what this did was more than double our population, including all the Palmer Sea area, including area north of Seminole Heights. Tremendous difference, again, more than doubling our population. Then we had a much smaller one, I think it was 61, maybe 62, Port Tampa, which was a separate municipality, became part of the city of Tampa. Then during Mayor Martinez's administration, the Tampa Palms area was annexed. There were a couple of different annexations, which also clearly is making a difference now. Annexation has been a difficult issue in Tampa in that many people tend to oppose it, or did oppose it, for a variety of reasons. The one that was accomplished in '53 only was accomplished because the state legislature decided, our delegation, including Mr. Sam Gibbons and Senator Branch and Representative Johnson, realized that we weren't going to accomplish an annexation if suburbanites had a say in it. The way it worked, in 1947, for example, they tried an annexation, but you had to have it approved separately by those in the central city and by those in the suburbs. Those in the city of Tampa, which again was relatively small at that time, supported it, but the suburbanites turned it down by a very significant margin. A couple other efforts were turned down as well. Finally, when Mr. Sam Gibbons ran in '52, he said that I'm going to support annexation, and he appeared before the Chamber of Commerce, the Executive Committee, the Board of Governors, I guess it's called, and he said, I'm going to support it without a referendum. And if I remember correctly, Mr. Johnson agreed to that, and I think Senator Branch as well did.
And he won that election, I assume.
He won the election, and annexation occurred.
So really what you're saying, and I think that this is what people might not understand, areas like Inner Bay and Palmacia existed as part of unincorporated Hillsborough County up until 1953.
That is right.
And
yes.
There were people there. You said the population almost doubled.
Oh, there were plenty of people there. The population actually more than doubled.
So really, and I think that it would be interesting because the concept that Inner Bay somehow wasn't part of Tampa seems very strange to me. Being that I wasn't, well, I was a little kid then, but didn't remember it being unincorporated county. So really, it was very much in the situation that an area like Carrollwood or Brandon would be in today, as far as just being, I guess, had a name, Palmacia, but it was unincorporated Hillsborough County.
Sure. The city limits down Kennedy, which initially was called Lafayette, ended at Howard.
So Palmacia really, from a political perspective, was represented by the Board of County Commissioners at that time, not Tampa City Council, prior to the annexation.
Yes, yes, that's right. It doesn't mean they couldn't have influence in the city, of course, but they weren't represented politically.
Now, once the annexation took place, you said it sounded like it wasn't voluntary on their part. Did the bad feelings kind of go away fairly quickly, or did that linger for a while?
I don't know. I don't think the bad feelings had any major repercussions one way or another. I assume it was relatively accepted, and I don't know that there was long-felt antagonism.
One thing I wanted to touch upon, the way you talked about the annexations taking place before, you said the state legislature got involved. Now, is that different than the system we have now? You mentioned that Tampa Palms was annexed in the 70s.
Yeah, last I looked at the state legislation, which was several years ago, so perhaps it's changed. you had a distinction between involuntary and voluntary annexation. And basically with Tampa Palms, you had, what, one or two major landowners, if I recall, Mr. Good and maybe a few others, and basically no one living there. So they petitioned to become part of the city of Tampa. Obviously, they had already spoken with Mayor Martinez, etc., and it was accomplished very, very easily. City Council basically just had to vote. However, if, for example, and needless to say this won't occur, the annexation was proposed involving Carrollwood, you would need an independent vote in Carrollwood and the city of Tampa. I believe that's still the way it stands.
So it would still stand that way unless somebody interceded and actually changed the system.
Yes, sir. What we actually tried with 3 different city-county consolidations, the latter part of the 60s and early 70s, and actually Mayor Greco was in office in his first time in office when at least 2 of these were attempted. But again, so you would consolidate the city of Tampa and Hillsborough County, similar to what happened in Jacksonville successfully. But again, 3 different times, the people in the county overwhelmingly voted against it.
And then it didn't pass and kind of was forgotten about.
Yes.
Well, that's interesting. I think now one of the issues, just touching on consolidation, is a way of, I guess, trying to consolidate certain services rather than an out-and-out annexation that's discussed on different levels from time to time. Does that accomplish the same thing or just part of it?
It's a piecemeal type of reform that's designed to accomplish efficiencies in service delivery. I would assume that it oftentimes does, but maybe sometimes doesn't. To be honest, I don't know what the outcomes tend to be. But that's fairly typical because major consolidations are so difficult to accomplish in most instances. Same with major annexations. So what you do is just look at issue by issue, service by service, and see if the services can be delivered better. With the library system, we now have the countywide library system. Well, before the city of Tampa had its own, that was an example. And I think most people are under the impression that it was a positive change.
Mm-hmm. So people might be willing to accept consolidation of services easier than out-and-out annexation?
In some instances, yes, I think so.
Even though it probably accomplishes some of the same things?
Revolving around particular services, sure.
Mm-hmm. Just to touch upon one annexation that I assume was probably contested, it was Port Tampa was actually a city, wasn't it?
It was, and it was 1961. Again, on my graded years, maybe 62, I think 61. It was worked out so that became part of the city of Tampa. Now, in terms of long-time antagonisms, there I think you had some. People there were fiercely independent, many of them at least, and it was something that was clearly resented. In fact, I was at a lecture last night on Tampa's involvement in the Spanish-American War. And Port Tampa was the place where the soldiers left from, of course. And that was the major port. And there were a couple of citizens there who obviously were citizens of the separate municipality of Port Tampa. And you can you could tell they were a little bit upset still.
Right. Actually, I did have a citizen approach me at a meeting, and they were upset about Port Tampa being annexed.
They had pride in their community.
I was surprised. I didn't realize that it had lasted this long. When we return, we'll talk some more about influence in the history of Tampa.
Hands need hands to help you see what lies ahead, what you want to be. Hands need hands, a hand to reach.
Kids today need extra help to stay in school.
A hand.
Communities and Schools brings hands in need together with hands that can help.
For Susan Chang, who spends most of her income on rent. For Felicia Hicks, whose 3 children still share the same bedroom. And for Jose Saban, who dreams of one day parking in his own garage. Introducing 1-888-HOME for Us, the toll-free call that gives you all the information you'll need to own your first home. Call now. Remember, the help is yours free, but a home is yours forever.
That's my dad. And that's Mom. Dad's got an idea, a way to get rid of all the grody garbage that's polluting the world. He's invented a big rocket ship to shoot all the garbage into outer space. Mom's not sure, but Dad says His invention will save the world.
There's an easier way to save the world. Recycle. For your free recycling action guide, write Recycle. Environmental Defense Fund, 257 Park Avenue South, New York, New York.
Welcome back to Beyond Today. I'm your host, Ray Sharmonti, and we've been discussing annexation and other issues from Tampa's past history. My guest is Robert Kerstein from the University of Tampa. Bob, if I may call you that,
Please
since
do.
I've known you quite a while, I wanted to go back a little bit into the politics of Tampa. I find that very interesting because you said we were a diverse community, different than a lot of traditional southern cities. The Latin influence, I guess, is what I see as being an important difference. When did the Latin community first begin to influence the politics of the city, or really have a place at the table, so to speak?
Politics in terms of electoral politics, Latin communities' involvement was relatively limited initially in 1900, 1910, 1920 for different reasons. One being a relatively small proportion of Latin community were citizens. They chose not to be. Many Cubans, for example, would oftentimes go back to Cuba for a period of time and then come back here, for example, during the long cigar strikes which occurred. Secondly, I think many Latins didn't really see any reason to participate in local politics in that they were involved in the union movement in the cigar factories and felt that they had much more at stake there than they did in terms of electing people to the city council, even to the position of mayor. Thirdly, as you know, the Latins had clubs, several clubs revolving around social life, also providing medical care, which are very, very important to their well-being and their, social lives. And to me, my guess would be electoral politics were basically insignificant compared to the clubs, compared to the union movement. The Latins were very heavily involved in unions, many, and including, by the way, Latin women played a very major role, even before women had the right to vote. And that's what preoccupied their attention. However, clearly by the 30s, now you had some Latins on the city council, don't get me wrong, but clearly by the 30s, Latins became more mobilized in trying to elect people to political office and getting involved in politics, electing several people to the city council. When I say Latins, that includes Italian, Cuban, and Spanish population. It's my impression, maybe I'm wrong here, Ray, that the Italian population was a little more active in terms of politics and getting involved and getting people elected. As you well know, later on, we had people of Latin descent being elected mayor, but Latins got involved before then.
And that was really probably in the 60s, was the first Latin mayor?
Well, Mayor Nick Nucio was elected in 1956. He served until 59. Then he was defeated by Julian Lane, but then Nucio came back and defeated Lane. And then, of course, De Greco won, defeating Nucio plus some other people. And then Mr. Poe and then Mayor Martinez. So you had different people of Latin descent being elected mayor. Now, Mayor Martinez, I believe, Spanish descent. Mayor Nucio, I believe, Italian. So not the same, but still Latin's involvement in politics.
So
certainly.
now it's kind of mixed. It's really probably isn't an issue any longer.
In some races, it certainly can be, but it's generally not in the forefront.
As a top issue, like it might have
Generally
been.
speaking, not. I think it was in one of the races involving Mr. Salsinas, for example, to some extent playing a role, but for the most part, not.
One thing that you mentioned that I would think would be different is you mentioned a strong union involvement in Tampa. I don't think of southern cities as having unions, so is that one of the unique things?
It was relatively atypical, and not only unions, but some very militant unions. There's actually conflicts among unions in the cigar factory for a period of time. Some unions associated basically with the AFL-CIO, might not have been called that at the time, but an umbrella organization. Others associated with more militant union members who, in terms of their philosophy, was socialist to some degree, anarchist, a wide variety of ideologies. So it was a strong union movement, sometimes competition between unions, some long strikes met with oftentimes hostility by Tampa's elite. After all, the economic base of Tampa, to a significant degree, was cigars. Now, the port was important. There were other enterprises, but the cigars were clearly the lifeblood of the community to a great degree, 1900, 1910, 1920. So you have the interesting example, for example, interesting incident. At one point, I'm not good at years, maybe 1900, 1901, I don't recall. There was a strike, and some of the elite of Tampa kidnapped some of the strike leaders and sent them on a boat, I think it was off to Honduras, and suggested they not return to the city. Professor Ingalls at USF has written a book about urban vigilantes in Tampa, talking about this type of activity.
Well, that I guess gives us an interesting perspective, because I know we discussed before the show, it appears nice to some people when a community just seems to be able to do something with no debate and everything runs real smooth, but maybe that isn't an asset. As I think about the diversity here, maybe we shouldn't expect things to run so smooth, but really expect a lot of debate to take place, since we have all these different interests.
I think what happened here to some degree is, for a period of time in the late 50s into the 60s, into the 70s to some extent, early 70s, you did have a relatively cohesive group of business people, white businessmen, making most of the major decisions. Now again, there was splits between them, but the decision-making circles were relatively closed, and you could point to certain people, and most would agree, yeah, these were the movers and shakers. Almost everyone would point to Mr. McGinnis of Tampa Electric. They would point to Mr. Ferguson, associated with Likes Brothers Interests, and you can name, a few others. Now, they accomplished some things, and one could disagree on the pros and cons of a variety of projects, and also Chamber of Commerce was very important. Mr. McGinnis was important within it, and you had some strong leadership there, in addition to the two people I mentioned. However, certainly it was an exclusionary politics. African Americans had a limited role. There were a few African Americans who sometimes were consulted, but still a limited role. There were some neighborhood groups that had some influence, but neighborhoods weren't strongly organized. Women played a very minimal role in the politics of the community. So what you had was an evolution in the 70s, 80s, and certainly the 90s, where different groups coalesced and tried to gain influence. I think that generally is a healthy process. Now, ideally, what you would like is a process, maybe Hillsborough tomorrow is a good example, some process whereby you try to bring together different elements of the community, have some level of cohesiveness, emerge from honest debate, and some leadership that can move the community in particular directions. It's not easy to do. That's the ideal, in my opinion. You don't want fragmentation, hyperpluralism. On the other hand, you certainly don't want to go back 1950s, 1960s with a few white men making decisions outside the public eye.
Mm-hmm. One of the issues I think that the community has to make decisions on is growth, and we talked a little bit about annexation, but let's kind of come forward a little to where we are now. Growth was a big issue here probably in the 70s and 80s. Do you see it as still a big debated issue, the growth of the community?
I think in some areas it certainly is. Obviously the Lutz area, the issue of growth is high on the agenda. So I'd say in some areas, yes. You obviously know better than I where the controversies are. As far as the city of Tampa itself, outside of the new Tampa area, I would say there's not that many opportunities for growth in terms of, built development. The issue is downtown, and we have a real issue there. To what degree should resources go to downtown to subsidize development in one way or another, where the resources could be spent in neighborhoods, conceivably for housing programs, even economic development efforts in neighborhoods revolving around, for example, one of our community development corporations. So you still have issues of growth in the city and certainly in some areas of the county in terms of where our resources should go, to what degree growth should be allowed. Obviously in the county, environmental issues are clearly important, and sometimes growth clearly is seen, rightfully so in my eyes, as detrimental to the environment and should be strongly regulated. You had major conflicts, I do know, late 80s, early 90s regarding the growth plan. Sierra Club and many civic groups challenging the growth plan, saying it allowed too rapid growth in too many areas of the county.
Well, I guess that's what I'd like to focus on. You mentioned that I probably would know that, but sometimes when you're very close to something, you have a distorted view. My perception is that growth is an issue, but it isn't as quite an important issue as it was in the late 80s. It seemed more volatile then, and again, it's just my perception. Do you view it that way, or do you think that that is as big an issue now as it was?
I guess I would say that a couple of groups that were very actively involved in the growth controversy in the late 80s, early 90s, Florida Consumer Action Network, Sierra Club, are still very important groups and relatively well organized, but maybe not as much able to get the voice out there to be heard by the present group of elected officials, for example, on the county commission. Doesn't mean that growth is an important issue, doesn't mean that people aren't strongly concerned about it, but maybe for whatever reasons they're not able to get the voices heard. I think for a period of time, late 1990, with the election of the Board of County Commissioners in the 1990 elections, 91, 92, by the way, I thought we had an outstanding board during those years, and I think that a variety of interests were able to be heard to some degree. I'm not suggesting that all were satisfied with the results, clearly not, but you did have commissioners, I think, who were relatively open to different views, including those people who said we had to better manage growth, pay more attention to environmentalism, etc. Now, we also had a board 83 to 85. Ironically, 3 of the board members appointed, because 3 of the Board of County Commissioners were sent to jail for taking bribes, who that was also, I'd say, relatively far-sighted, relatively open to different viewpoints, etc.
One of the reasons, as I think about it, though, maybe because the growth rate simply isn't as high now as it was in the late 80s, and maybe automatically when it's not as high, it is less of a huge issue, even though certainly it still is an issue.
Sure.
Talking a little bit about the situation with annexation, because I think that can affect a city, it probably is going to be difficult for Tampa to annex other areas. Do you see them annexing new areas in the future?
I don't know if there'll be any annexation, but clearly we're not talking about dramatic annexations. I think the City Council is talking about one now, or has been talking about one. I'm sorry, I haven't been following it. But certainly nothing comparable to the 53 annexation. It won't be anything like that. Maybe what you referred to before, talking about efficiencies in service delivery, etc., but not major expansion of the city boundaries.
Now, there's some other cities in this country that's not the case with. I believe you mentioned Houston, and there may have been other cities where they have very liberal annexation policies.
The way it worked in Houston is the city council passed an annexation bill and they annexed territory.
And the territory had nothing to say about it, or?
Not formally, they didn't get an independent vote. So it was very easy to accomplish. I think, however, that one would have to look at Houston and ask whether that experience is all positive. I think annexation is certainly desirable if the alternative is fragmentation. If you look at metropolitan areas up north, St. Louis has, I think, 96 different incorporated suburbs. Pittsburgh, I think, has more than that. Now that, in my eyes, is extremely undesirable. You have so many different communities, each with their own tax base and service delivery responsibilities, and you have tremendous inequities. Some central city oftentimes, and many suburbs just terribly hard-pressed to provide enough revenue, to bring in enough revenue to provide services, while others are living high in the hog. They can do great suburban areas of wealthy people in a nice commercial district, perhaps. So certainly you don't want that situation. We're relatively fortunate in that we just have the 2 relatively small incorporated suburbs.
Well, really, a local example, I guess, would be Pinellas County, which has 23 cities, and it does seem to be fragmented sometimes when they try to accomplish something. So I'm not sure that that's good either. It concerns me when I hear talk about incorporating more cities in Hillsborough County, because then you do have more people involved with different opinions and more of a local view rather than a regional view of our problems. I'd like to thank today's guest for talking with us about the City of Tampa's history and growth. Next month, we'll talk about planned communities, another issue we'll face beyond today. Let us know if you have comments about today's show. You can reach us at our hotline or on email as listed here. I'm Ray Charmonti, and on behalf of the Planning Commission, I thank you for thinking beyond today.